If the Indiana Democratic primary election were held today, whom would you favor among Hubert Humphrey, Edward Muskie, George Wallace, or undecided?
If the Indiana Democratic primary election were held today, whom would you favor among Hubert Humphrey, Edmund Muskie, George Wallace, or undecided?
If the Indiana Democratic primary election were held today, whom would you favor among Hubert Humphrey, Edmund Muskie, George Wallace, or undecided?
Tonight, political polls. Your opinion counts. Now, NPAC senior correspondent Robert MacNeil.
Good evening. Tonight we consider political polling, almost as important an ingredient in our election process today as the candidates themselves and the issues they address. But before we get into the detailed business of polling, let's have a look at the latest standings of the Democratic contenders coming out of yesterday's primaries in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Here are the nearly final results. In Pennsylvania, Senator Hubert Humphrey came first with 35% of the vote and winning 57 convention delegates. His main opponent, Senator Muskie, dropped into an almost three-way tie for a bad second place, with George Wallace, who'd virtually ignored the state, and with George McGovern, who had given it minimal attention. Despite the full backing of the Democratic organization in Pennsylvania, Muskie got only 29 convention delegates to 37 for Senator McGovern. Wallace picked up 2. Senator Jackson came in a poor 5th with 3% of the popular vote. In Massachusetts, George McGovern, who targeted most of his recent energies on that state, swept the board, getting a clear majority of 51% of the popular votes and the entire slate of 102 delegates to the Miami Convention. Senator Muskie, again with the backing of well-known regular Democrats, came second with only 22% and won no delegates. For the rest, Senator Humphrey and George Wallace tied for third place with 8% each. Shirley Chisholm came next with 4%, and Wilbur Mills fifth with 3%. Well now, polling. This year, it is estimated that presidential candidates alone will spend up to $2 million on political polls. It's a lucrative business. There are now at least 74 firms in the country dealing primarily with political polling. And for several years, the effects of their work have been causing anxiety. Put simply, the chief worry is whether polls do not simply measure public opinion, but affect it when they're published or leaked before an election. Are the polls trustworthy? Well, it's a very broad subject, and we want to look at one part of it tonight. How are polls actually taken, and how accurate are they? To study the process, NPAC commissioned a poll on the forthcoming primary in Indiana. We put ourselves in the position of one of the major candidates, Hubert Humphrey, and the poll was designed as though he had commissioned it for his own purposes. The pollster we chose is the young man who's been doing all George McGovern's polling this year, Pat Cadell of Cambridge Survey Research.
What we're looking for specifically in a political survey is identifying groups of people, where they are, who is movable, how the candidate reaches them, what are the things that will move those people, how is a candidate perceived, what are his problems, what does he have to overcome, and how does he most effectively deal with different groups in the population.
We're going to be conducting a political poll here in the metropolitan Indianapolis area for Cambridge Survey Research. And we're going to work today and tomorrow. And we have 105 interviews to get in the metropolitan Indianapolis area. It's going to be conducted statewide, but we're just going to cover this area here.
Now, we'd like to know what this is going to cost us and what we're going to get in terms of accuracy for our money.
The optimally most accurate surveys would be one where we took 1,200 to 1,500 interviews that made the margin of error very low. that would run in the vicinity of about $20 an interview, which obviously would exceed over $20,000 cost.
$20,000? Well, we can't afford $20,000, and suppose that our client, if he were Hubert Humphrey, couldn't afford $20,000, what would we get for less?
Cost of surveys are a function of two things. One is the number of interviews we take, and the second one is the length of the questionnaire. Now, we can cut the sample size from 1,200 to 500, still have a fairly representative sampling of the entire population of Indiana, the Democratic population of Indiana. We've increased the margin of error somewhat.
Some of you probably wonder why I'm sending you out so far, but they want to get a good representative account of the Indianapolis area. Some of you are going into very high-income areas. Some of you are going into very low-income areas. Some of you are going into black, going into some of the ethnic areas. But we want to get a very, very good coverage of the whole city.
We've probably increased the margin of error from around 3% or 2.5 to 3% up into the 4 and 5.5% margin of error.
That means that if the yes was 55%, it could be wrong down to 50 or wrong up to 60.
Exactly.
Now, is that an acceptable margin of error?
To most candidates, it probably is.
Well, what will 500 interviews cost us?
A little over $10 an interview, probably.
So remember, keep that blank expression on your face. If no matter what they tell you, you just shake your head yes, but no expression, because we don't want you to in any way bias the respondent.
Is that just the interviews we get for that $10?
No. What you get for the $10 will be the completion of the interviews, our total analysis. We'll be in the field several days. We'll then tabulate on our computers the results. Then John Gorman and I will sit down and do a detailed analysis of the data, not only looking at what the surface figures, but what do those figures mean?
Now, as I understand it, there are roughly 1 million Democratic voters in Indiana. What confuses a lot of people is how you can make only 500 interviews speak for 1 million others.
The question is a sampling question. If you go to the doctor, you get a blood test. The doctor doesn't take all 16 pints of your blood to make a test. What he does is he pricks your finger and takes a sampling of the blood in which to determine the test. And in a sense, that's what we're doing with sampling a population. We're taking a sampling of the million.
This is not a real strict probability sample like some of you have done, where you've got to go down one block and around the other block, you know, like we've done in some of these. They more or less pick the general area, so you have the discretion here of picking where you want to start.
I mean, I don't care which finger I take your blood out of. I want a little piece, and I'll pick that at random. And the same thing, principle. We're getting down to that street level. We just want to pick one of the streets and take our 5 interviews.
You might have to walk quite far in between houses.
So that we've given, through this whole process, given every Democrat a chance to be chosen in Indiana.
Oh, pencils. Be sure you take your pencils with you. Nobody writes in ink. Everybody writes in pencil. Okay?
Okay, let me see if I understand what you said. There are roughly 1 million voters you're looking at in Indiana. You're going to go to where those voters are concentrated. And for instance, in the biggest city, Indianapolis, representing 18% of that Democratic vote, you're going to do 18% of your interviewing. You're going to break the city down into its election districts and do 95 interviews by choosing 19 districts, 5 interviews a district, at random. And then within each district, you choose a 4-block area at random, go to the street corner in the center of that block. Your interviewer starts walking along and goes to every 15th house and does the interview there.
Hello. I work for Community Market Research, and we were trying to find out how the people in Indiana feel about problems facing America, and I would like for you to answer a few questions on a confidential basis. Are you registered to vote in Indiana?
Yes, I am.
All right. Are you registered to vote Democrat, Republican, or Independent?
Democrat.
Could I come in and go ahead with the survey? It takes about 15, 20 minutes.
That's all right.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Mrs. Fitzpatrick, and I'm taking a public survey for Community Market Research. We are trying to find out how the people in Indiana feel about the problems facing America. I would like to ask you a few short questions on a confidential basis.
Are you registered to vote in Indiana?
Yes, ma'am.
How are you registered to vote? As a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent?
A Democrat.
May we step outside here, sir, and be a little more comfortable?
And what do you feel is the most important issue facing the people of the United States today?
I would say it'd have to be the job situation.
What do you feel is the most important issue facing the people of the U.S. today?
Well, I feel that inflation, for one thing, is a problem, and also the war that we have now in Vietnam.
Look at this card.
Yeah.
On it are some of the issues facing the people of the U.S. and Indiana. I would like you to rate each issue individually on a scale from 1, meaning not an important issue at all, to 5, meaning a very important issue.
Yeah.
The war in Vietnam.
I would rate that 5.
I'd have to say 5 on the war.
All right. Air and water pollution, what number would you give me? You can use the same numbers twice.
Well, it would be between a 4 and a 5, too.
Well, that also is 5. I'd rate that 5.
Tax reform.
Well, I believe tax reform, we need some of that. We need that in this country.
What number for it,
I'd be
sir?
5 on that.
I would rate that a 3.
Drug abuse?
Drug abuse above anything else, more than anything else, 5.
Inflation.
Also 5.
Now, inflation, let's put that on number 5.
Race relations?
That would be a 3.
I don't believe in segregation or anything like that. You know what I mean? I believe that equal education and opportunity for all race people. So I'd rate that to be up 5.
Unemployment.
Well, that is the rate of unemployment right now is just about the number that you're asking me for, which is about 5%.
Number 5.
Equal rights for women?
5.
And improving health care?
I would say 4.
Would you agree or disagree with the following statements? Most politicians don't really care about people like me. Agree or disagree?
I don't know that I'd say that they don't really care. They love me when it's time to vote.
I'd like to believe that they do, that they are really concerned, so I'll say yes.
All right.
Overall, I'd say most of them are in for the good of the people or for the welfare of the people. Yeah, I believe that.
And you were kind of in a Republican area out there, weren't you?
Yes.
And she says, Joan, I'm out here, and I've been walking around for 2 hours. I can't find a Democrat. What do I do?
Well, every time I got a Democrat and they started to refuse me, I begged like mad and talked fast.
Do you think some of the language on the questionnaire, do you think those people understood?
No, I do not. I think it was geared much too high for them. I think it was far over the head of some of them.
Well, what did they tell you then when you asked them these questions? We got interviews from them.
Well, most of them are too proud to admit that they don't understand a word, and so they'll just tell you anything. For instance, they were talking about these, when you ask them what you think the major issues are, they say high prices. But when you come to inflation, they'll give it a number 1 on their scale from 1 to 5. So that shows you that they don't know what the word inflation means.
I had problems on that. They would start, and you can see that I've had to erase them when they'd say, well, now, wait a minute. Will you read that to me again? And they would have told me, like, they would put a 1, and then they'd back off and tell me, no, that's wrong. Go the other way. Let's put it a 5.
You know, that's so happens so much on so many of these surveys we do, is the language. The people who write the surveys, you know, are all very brilliant, college-educated people that write surveys, and they, you know, I sometimes don't think that they go out and actually talk to the people.
America's leaders have failed to tell the country the truth. Do you agree or disagree?
Yes, I agree on that. They have failed to tell them the complete truth. I think they've held the news media back a whole lot and haven't given them the true facts about things. I believe that.
No, I agree.
Okay. If the Indiana Democratic primary election were held today, whom would you favor among Hubert Humphrey, Edward Muskie, and George Wallace?
I would have to say Humphrey.
George Wallace.
If your first choice, Hubert Humphrey, were to drop out, who would be your second choice?
Muskie.
I believe The governor would be about my second choice if Wallace should drop out.
Hubert Humphrey is the kind of experienced leader we need as president. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would say of the candidates running now, I'd have to say he is.
I don't believe he has the experience to be in there.
Hubert Humphrey is a man of the past, and we need a fresher leader as president. Would you agree or disagree?
I would like to see a fresher one, yes.
Right, right.
Hubert Humphrey is too much of a politician, changing his stance to what he thinks the voters want to hear.
Right, I believe that, yeah.
Agree.
If someone is ahead in a survey, do you feel more likely or less likely to vote for him?
I don't think the survey would really have too much to do with it. It would depend on what the man, if I approved of him.
Well, I go by the way I believe in a person. I don't let a survey change my opinion or my vote or anything on anything.
The survey's done now. What did you find in Indiana for Humphrey, and what does it mean in terms of what he can do in the campaign, how he could use it?
Well, Humphrey was doing very well in Indiana when this survey was taken. He had 39% of the vote. Edmund Muskie, who at about the same time the survey was taken, decided not to pursue an active campaign, had 27% of the vote. George Wallace had 19%, and there were 15% undecided. That was at the moment. There's movement going on, and these figures are going to change, obviously, during the course of the campaign.
Well, with Muskie out of the race now, what's going to happen to his people? What were their second choices?
Well, his voters' second choice very strongly to Humphrey. 80% of them go to Humphrey. About 10% of them go to Wallace, and the rest are sort of undecided where they're going. So that Humphrey initially picks up a great number of those people.
Now, what about the undecideds, the 15% who are undecided? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, it's very interesting. When you look at the undecideds themselves, I think that you'll find that because of some of the attitudes that they have and some of the feelings they have, that George Wallace has a great potential for picking up large numbers of that undecided vote.
What makes you think that?
Well, we had some questions on attitudes and moods in the country, the way people felt. And if you look at it, we asked several things. We asked people to place the country in terms of a ladder of 11 rungs, where they thought the country was today, where they thought it was 5 years ago, where they expected to be 5 years from now. And today people put the country at about 5.5 on that ladder. 5 years ago, they thought the country was much better off. They had it at 6.3. And 5 years from now, the average is only 5.9. So actually people think the country, most people in Indiana think the country will be at a lower point in 1977 than it was in 1967. And this creates, first of all, an attitude that the country is in some trouble. When we asked them some other direct questions, Robin. We read them some statements that we've been using. We asked them to agree or disagree with those statements, and one of them was that most politicians don't really care about people like me. 64% of those people, the Democrats in Indiana, agreed with that statement. Only 31% disagreed, which we feel is fairly high. The Wallace voters were the highest. 73% of the Wallace voters agreed, and almost as many undecideds agreed, 70%. So the undecideds feel very strongly about that. We had another question about over the last 5 years, America's leaders have failed to tell the country the truth. And 76% of the people, of the Democrats in Indiana, agreed that America's leaders had not told them the truth. And those are very important kind of mood feelings that people are obviously somewhat suspicious and unhappy and distrustful. And undecided voters can be very strongly that way. Wallace tends to do very well with these kinds of voters, so that you have to say that he has a very good potential for picking up those voters.
So in other words, Hubert Humphrey, as our client, has something to fear from the potential Wallace vote. What about Humphrey's own strengths and weaknesses in Indiana as they were revealed by the survey?
He had several weaknesses that potentially could be a problem. One of them was a lot of people feel that Hubert Humphrey has been around too long, even if they like him, that the country needs newer leadership. It sort of fits in with the feeling that where the country is. Probably even more important, we had an agree-disagree question that Hubert Humphrey is too much of a politician, changing his positions on stands to what he thinks the voters want to hear. And overall, 48% of the voters in Indiana agreed with that statement. 43% disagreed.
And what issues do you think he should be emphasizing there to appeal to this segment of voters? What did you find?
Well, overall, we found some issue intensity scales. Just sort of look at that. We found the war was very high in intensity, and so was drug abuse. So were so were taxes and inflation. Some of the economic issues.
When we commissioned the poll, we asked you also to try and find out something about how the voters look at polls and what they think about them. How did that come out?
Well, we asked the question if someone were ahead in a survey, how likely you would be to vote for the person. 82% of the people said it would make no difference, it wouldn't affect them. 13% said that it would make them more likely. 6% said that it would make them less likely.
Well, would this poll, when we publish it, we are publishing it in this program, do you think that will have an effect of making more people vote for Humphrey simply because they see he's ahead?
I don't think so. The vast, vast majority of people are not going to be influenced by those kinds of things.
Well, now, what would your general conclusions be on this poll if you were presenting them to a candidate like Humphrey?
Well, I think it's clear that Humphrey is presently leading in Indiana. Wallace appears to have a hidden strength among the undecideds. Crossovers may help Wallace, people crossing over Republicans and Independents. The base of Humphrey's support is built on black voters and lower and middle income voters. People attracted at Muskie's, we said before, tended to be middle and upper income voters. And Muskie's vote support was very weak, and these are voters he would need to look at. That with Muskie out of the race, Humphrey does pick up a lot of the support. That Humphrey's greatest weaknesses, he has some good strengths. He's liked and he's qualified. His weaknesses tend to be indecision and sort of feeling that he's not very strong on the issues, or he may have been around too long.
Could Humphrey possibly lose in Indiana if he decided on the basis of this poll, and he got complacent, to spend no time there and no media effort?
There's a possibility. There's a possibility that, for instance, his voters would not turn out. There would not be an effort. That Wallace might be able to come into the state and campaign against politicians, people like Humphrey, who are taking Indiana for granted, who aren't there, that he cares, and this is a way to protest. In which case, there's the potential for protest even among the Humphrey vote. And, you know, Wallace is getting even 6% of the black votes. I think there's an indication that Wallace has some strength at picking up protest votes. So, you know, he could conceivably lose. It's not a solid situation.
One of the things that intrigues us is how much attention politicians pay to this sort of survey on which they spend so much of their campaign funds. And we're particularly curious to know how Senator Humphrey, who's the subject of much of this survey, how much attention he pays to these polls and how big a factor they are in his political life.
Well, if I had have depended entirely upon the polls that I saw, for example, in November of 1971 or October, I most likely would not have been a candidate because the polls were not that encouraging to me. But what I did do before I made the decision was to engage or commission a rather extensive national poll, both on issues and on my own self, how people viewed me, my limitations, hopefully some assets, how they saw me as a person, as a political figure, and my rank or rating with others.
What about the effect of these polls on attracting money to a campaign?
They help. I think the polls do help in that. It's always a selling point, in other words, for your treasurer, for your finance officer, for your campaign manager, to be able to go to a potential donor and say, look, we've got a man here that looks good in the polls.
What do you think are the risks to you in polls as a politician? What do you have to beware of?
I think you have to beware that they don't govern your actions. They can't make the decision for you. You shouldn't let them make the decision for you. You should not abdicate your role of leadership, and you ought never to just be wedded to whatever result is there.
Could you run a political campaign today without taking polls?
Yes, you could, but I think in a way it might be rather foolish. because it would be more expensive. Politics is kind of disorganized or organized waste. I don't know which is the better way to state it. A good deal of money is expended without ever knowing what's going to be the result. One thing that a poll can show you is that in a particular area, for example, there just aren't any votes for you. Now, you're foolish to go spending a lot of money there. I think that polls are actually an economy measure. If you have enough capital in the beginning to really commission the polls that you need, you may very well save money on printed material, on media. You may very well save a good deal of your time and your energy. There's always a way to really judge polls. Those that come out good for you, those are the good polls. Those that don't show you up very good, those are the polls that are really not very scientific. So saith the candidate, you know.
Would you trust your political life to a poll if you were a politician?
Yes, I think I would, with reservations. There is no proof of any bad effects of polls, but that's not still the anxieties about them. Some well-known polling firms now stay out of polling in primaries. Many newspapers and television news organizations have adopted strict rules on publishing polls to ensure that the source and nature of any poll are made known and to guard against self-serving leaks. Congressman Lucian Nidze of Michigan has introduced for the second time a bill requiring public disclosure of any poll in its entirety 72 hours after part of it has been published. It's wrong to be hysterical about polls or to lend them occult significance, however much they satisfy that basic human desire to be able to see into the future. Pollsters are not oracles. Their methods, perhaps puzzling at times, are scientific when they're scrupulous about it, and their polls are useful tools. But they can also be weapons. Just as politicians in ancient times were not above manipulating the oracles, politicians today manipulate polls as a legitimate campaign tactic, revealing what serves their purposes and hiding what doesn't. Full disclosure might guard a little against that. But a greater danger to democracy, perhaps, is the tendency of politicians to use polls not to lead the country, but to follow it, to discover what the fears and prejudices of the electorate are, and then simply to play to them. Public disclosure of the full contents of polls might also protect us from that. Next week, A Public Affair looks at the North Carolina primary and President Nixon's so-called Southern strategy. Until then, I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night for NPACT.
If you would like a copy of our complete Indiana poll, including all questions, answers, and analysis, write to NPACT, National Public Affairs Center for Television, Indiana Poll, Washington, D.C. 20006. A Public Affair is a production of NPACT, the National Public Affairs Center for Television.
I'm Robert MacNeil with Peter Lisagor of the Chicago Daily News, Neil MacNeil of Time Magazine, Charles Cordry of the Baltimore Sun, and a guest fourth correspondent analyzing the major news events of the week on Washington Week in Review from NPACT, the National Public Affairs Center for Television.